Buenas tardes a todas y todos. Es un honor darles la bienvenida a este panel en el que vamos a discutir uno de los temas, en mi opinión, más relevantes y complejos de nuestro tiempo: el impacto que la inteligencia artificial tiene en la democracia, las elecciones y la gobernanza. Y un agradecimiento especial a la profesora Maureen Webb, porque su conferencia sirvió de una estupenda introducción a este panel. Para ello, contamos con tres panelistas muy calificados, a quienes les agradecemos de manera especial haber sacado tiempo de sus apretadas agendas para acompañarnos en la tarde de hoy. Ellos son Nueva Giansiracusa, profesor de la Universidad de Bentley, Massachusetts; Mekela Panditharatne, asesora principal del Programa para la Democracia del Centro Brennan, Universidad de New York; y Virginia Linares, profesora de Periodismo de la Universidad Complutense de Madrid, España, que es prácticamente la medianoche, así que le agradecemos de manera especial a Virginia que nos esté acompañando. Como decía, este tema, en mi opinión, es uno de los más importantes de nuestra época, que además de su impacto en diversos sectores claves de nuestras sociedades, presenta a su vez, y este me parece que es un tema que hay que ponerle mucha atención, un riesgo existencial. O sea, no es solamente las implicaciones que tiene en la economía, en el mundo del trabajo, en la salud, etcétera, sino también como riesgo existencial para la humanidad. Hoy más que nunca estamos frente a la tarea de comprender cómo esta tecnología puede fortalecer o en algunos casos desafiar los principios fundamentales de nuestra democracia, como aquí bien ha sido explicado. Déjenme darles dos ejemplos rápidamente. NVIDIA hoy es la empresa top en materia de inteligencia artificial. La acción de NVIDIA hace 5 años valía $4.65. Todos los que no hemos comprado acciones de NVIDIA nos tenemos que realmente golpear el pecho, porque hoy vale $122. En tan solo 3 años, NVIDIA se ha constituido en la tercera empresa de mayor valor empresarial, 2.8 trillones de dólares, solamente por detrás de Apple, que está a 3.4 trillones, y de Microsoft, que está a 3.1 trillón. Esto demuestra la velocidad con la cual una empresa en el ámbito de inteligencia artificial en tan solo 2 o 3 años se posiciona en este tercer lugar. Déjenme darle otro ejemplo que salió ayer. En el nuevo modelo OpenAI 01 acaba de hacer un test probando el OpenAI en una prueba sobre datos duros de científicos, o sea, en materia física, biología y química. El año pasado compitió ese mismo modelo, pero atrasado, 2023, con doctorados en las 3 disciplinas. Los doctorados humanos en las 3 disciplinas le ganaron 65 a 39% a OpenAI. Se hizo una prueba reciente con la versión actualizada, y la versión actualizada en un año sacó 78% de respuesta, 93% en el caso de física, mientras que los humanos con doctorado sacaron apenas por debajo del 70%. Esto demuestra no solamente el impacto que tiene, sino la velocidad con que va mejorando su capacidad de respuesta. Para preparar esta introducción, yo trabajé con ChatGPT 4 y lo primero que le hice es le pregunté si tú eres una inteligencia artificial, a lo cual Chat me contestó, efectivamente soy una inteligencia artificial. Entonces le dije esta mañana, explícame en qué consiste la inteligencia artificial, cómo te defines, Chat. Y me dijo textual, desde mi perspectiva como inteligencia artificial, la inteligencia artificial se puede definir como la capacidad de sistemas o máquinas para realizar tareas que normalmente requieren inteligencia humana. Me agregó, no tengo conciencia ni emociones, pero sí soy capaz de analizar grandes cantidades de información, reconocer patrones y aprender de los datos para mejorar mis respuestas. Me adelantó que la inteligencia artificial en general puede adoptar muchas formas, pero lo que nos define es su capacidad para aprender, adaptarse y automatizar procesos con el objetivo de resolver problemas de manera eficiente y en algunos casos imitar comportamientos inteligentes humanos. Finalmente le pregunté, tú como inteligencia artificial, ¿cuáles crees que son los riesgos de la inteligencia artificial en materia de democracia, elecciones y gobernanza? Y me identificó 4. Me dijo, el primero es el dilema de la autonomía algorítmica. El segundo me dijo son los sesgos y la equidad algorítmica. El tercero me dijo es la manipulación de la opinión pública a través de las campañas de desinformación, misinformation y malinformation. Y cuarto me dijo está el tema del futuro de la gobernanza automatizada. Añadió, en un escenario donde la inteligencia artificial siga avanzando en su capacidad para gestionar procesos complejos y optimizar la toma de decisiones, ¿hasta qué punto deberíamos confiar la gobernanza a sistemas automatizados? ¿Cómo equilibramos la eficiencia y precisión de la inteligencia artificial con la necesidad de mantener el juicio humano, la empatía, la ética y la rendición de cuentas en los procesos democráticos? Y me adelantó a su vez lo siguiente. El verdadero desafío en materia de inteligencia artificial es cómo logramos avanzar en marcos regulatorios que sin frenar el desarrollo en materia de inteligencia artificial, sí permitan seguir manteniendo el control humano sobre la inteligencia artificial. Con esta breve introducción le doy entonces ahora el uso de la palabra y si los panelistas que están acá presentes me permiten, le voy a dar primer lugar a Virginia Linares por la hora en Madrid para que por espacio de 10 minutos nos hagas la presentación, Virginia. Luego voy a pasar con Mekela y finalmente con Nueva. Virginia, tus 10 minutos. Gracias.
Sobre todo por esa introducción tan interesante que además va a ayudar a una presentación que yo quiero hacer un poco más gráfica. Me gustaría poder compartiros la pantalla para enseñaros algunas imágenes. Sobre todo, voy a hablar desde la perspectiva precisamente de la desinformación. Voy a daros sobre todo desde un punto de vista práctico, ¿verdad? Un breve repaso sobre un caso de análisis forense que se hace que nosotros hacemos con inteligencia artificial para combatir la desinformación y precisamente mi idea es exponer el caso de las elecciones norteamericanas. Esto es algo muy, muy relevante. Ahora ya lo tenemos. Perfecto. Voy a darle. Muy bien. Esto es un trabajo que desde la Universidad Complutense de Madrid es en la línea de investigación y la línea académica en la que yo me muevo, ¿no? Y entonces para mí es muy relevante sobre todo comenzar dónde estamos nosotros situados ahora mismo. Por ejemplo, el 70% de la población mundial utiliza Internet. Eso equivale a 5,4 millones de usuarios. Es decir, aquí tenemos que establecer un punto de partida, el cual es ese. ¿Por qué? Bueno, por ejemplo, como dice el catedrático de Sociología, Antonio Lucas Marín, la historia de la humanidad hay que interpretarla como la historia de la ampliación de la capacidad comunicativa. ¿Por qué? Porque vivimos actualmente en la sociedad de la interacción. Por ejemplo, podemos mirar lo que pasa un minuto en Internet. Esto pasa en un minuto en Internet de 2023, en el cual nosotros ahora mismo, de hecho, formamos parte de esa estadística y multiplicado, porque estamos a través de Zoom, a través de YouTube, a través de una llamada, a través de mensajes. Bueno, esto dice, por ejemplo, el experto en ciberseguridad y en comunicación digital, Adrián Moreno, con el que yo comparto muchos proyectos sobre la desinformación a través de la inteligencia artificial, pues las redes sociales fueron pensadas para facilitar la comunicación. Lo que pasa es que no todo el mundo es consciente de que mucha de esta información está disponible y puede ser utilizada con diferentes objetivos, desde planificar un crimen hasta realizar investigaciones. Es lo que estamos haciendo nosotros ahora mismo. Sin embargo, a su vez también cita este experto a Spaceforce una frase, ¿no? Que a mí me me gusta mucho, que dice, el único sistema seguro es aquel que se apaga, se coloca en un bloque de hormigón y se sella en una habitación revestida de plomo con guardias armados, y aún así tengo mis dudas, ¿no? Porque todo está en Internet, constantemente. Por eso hemos pasado de la sociedad tradicional a una sociedad moderna, luego a la sociedad de la información, a la sociedad de la comunicación, y ahora estamos inmersos en la sociedad de la interacción. Por ejemplo, en un día se generan más de 500 millones de tweets, más de 3,3 billones de emails. Entonces, vivimos sumergidos. ¿Qué pasa con ello? Por ejemplo, para hacer un poco más gráficas, ¿qué papel juega entonces la inteligencia en el periodismo? Bueno, tiene sus ventajas, pero también unas desventajas que incluso asustan, ¿no? Porque no sabemos muy bien hacia dónde nos está llevando, cuál es el camino que está tomando. Optimiza la difusión de noticias, por supuesto, nos supera en muchas cosas cognitivas, no lo podemos dudar, sobre todo cuando utiliza técnicas avanzadas de generación de un lenguaje totalmente natural. Lo podemos ver en un nuevo canal de noticias que se llama News GPT, el cual es 24 horas de información, con incluso presentadores generados por inteligencia artificial. ¿Qué nos dice la tendencia actual? Si este debate no podemos evadirlo, dice que podríamos llegar al punto en que los humanos tendríamos que adaptarnos a vivir siendo incluso inferiores a la tecnología, ¿no? Entonces, ¿por qué? ¿Cómo hacemos nosotros para combatir estas desventajas, ¿no? Bueno, utilizando la propia inteligencia artificial, ¿verdad? Porque es una realidad emergente que está transformando totalmente al periodismo. Ese es precisamente el trabajo en el que nosotros estamos inmersos. ¿Cómo afecta esto, por ejemplo, ¿no? ¿Cómo impactan en las elecciones de una forma realmente tergiversadora, a través de la desinformación? ¿Por qué? Bueno, ya lo dijo Bacon y siguió Hobbes, quien tiene la información tiene el poder. Entonces, ¿qué pasa? ¿Por qué se utiliza la inteligencia artificial para desinformar, para generar el caos? No, bueno, nosotros la utilizamos precisamente para combatir ese caos. Como por ejemplo, pongo dos casos muy breves, ¿no? Como por ejemplo esta imagen que salió sobre Kamala Harris, en la cual fue un post donde se publicó que ella era score de alto standing, ¿verdad? Cuando fue joven, con políticos, empresarios, jueces, incluso con lenguaje sensacionalista, en plan, bueno, los demócratas quieren tapar este escándalo, ¿no? Pero sin embargo, a través de herramientas especializadas, ¿verdad? Por ejemplo, como Hugging Face, ¿no? Se detectó de que esta imagen está generada en un 90% con inteligencia artificial. Entonces eso es importante. Luego, por supuesto, para corroborar esto, ¿verdad? Otra herramienta que se llama Forensic Study demuestra la clonación de imágenes, que son los puntos azules y rojos, ¿no? Esto quiere decir que la imagen ha sido clonada. Y, por supuesto, también se hizo una búsqueda inversa con 3 herramientas, Google, Yancey o Tineye, en las que dicen que estas son herramientas para fijar la huella digital que puede haber sobre esta imagen. Dice que esta imagen no hay una imagen anterior al 1 de agosto de 2024. ¿Por qué? Porque fue precisamente cuando propuso Kamala Harris a la candidatura por el Partido Demócrata. Entonces, estas 3 pruebas lo que hacen es generar desinformación. Es decir, un post tuvo casi 600.000 visualizaciones. Entonces, todo esto también nos lleva a otro ejemplo, ¿no? Todos sabemos el momento Donald Trump sufrió un atentado. Bueno, salió una imagen, ¿no? Totalmente tergiversada, en la que se expone, ¿verdad?, que los agentes del servicio secreto estaban sonriendo, ¿no? Y alegres como por lo que está sucediendo. Bueno, nosotros esa imagen, por supuesto, metimos igualmente a todas estas herramientas, ¿no? Y por ejemplo, Rubin Félix dice de que más del 70% de esta imagen está totalmente generada por inteligencia artificial, es decir, ha sido totalmente manipulada, ¿no? Lo mismo con Scali demuestra, si podéis ver los puntos azules y rojos, demuestra la clonación de imágenes que hay en esta fotografía. Y la búsqueda inversa, ¿no? La huella digital que hay en estas tres herramientas como Google, Yandex y Pinterest, nos dice que la imagen ha sido totalmente manipulada. ¿Por qué? El autor de la imagen original, ¿verdad? Un fotógrafo de la Associated Press, nos dice que no, esta es la imagen original, nos dice que no aparecen sonriendo, sino con un rostro totalmente serio. Entonces, todo esto que nos lleva, esto nos lleva a una reflexión y a un debate. La instantaneidad de Internet ha creado un entorno donde las mentiras y los rumores tienen más opciones de convertirse en noticias y viralizarse, ¿verdad? ¿Por qué? Porque la sociedad no sabe, claro, ese 70% de personas de la población mundial conectada a Internet, que tiene un 60% de que no sabe qué noticias son ciertas y cuáles no. Es decir, manifiestan una preocupación porque realmente confunden la realidad con la tergiversación e incluso la manipulación, ¿no? Entonces, todo esto tiene una explosión mediática sin precedentes. De hecho, la magnitud y el alcance que tiene la desinformación es descomunal. Y aquí está el debate, y es lo que general, ¿no? La batalla contra la desinformación, ¿dónde se da? Tenemos que tener la capacidad de generar pensamiento crítico y, por supuesto, una alfabetización digital, las medidas de seguridad nacional, el Big Data, incluso la propia inteligencia artificial, que es lo que nosotros usamos para detectar todos estos rumores o todos estos bulos, ¿verdad? Que generan esa desinformación en la sociedad, son necesarios para combatir la desinformación en Internet. ¿Por qué? Bueno, porque es lo que estamos tratando sobre todo en este foro. La desinformación atenta totalmente contra los principales valores de la democracia, como son la igualdad, la justicia, los derechos humanos. Entonces, ese es un punto, estamos en un punto de inflexión que no podemos pasar desapercibido. Por eso, tanto en este foro como en muchos otros, es importante poner el foco precisamente en eso, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, y ya con esto espero que haya sido bastante instructiva mi exposición y muchísimas gracias de nuevo tanto al presidente Fernando como a toda la organización del foro por esta invitación.
Muchas gracias, Virginia, realmente muy clara, muy precisa. And I would like now to invite the next speaker, Noah, please, for the next 10 minutes, if you can join us and give your presentation. I would like also to emphasize the importance. This is the super electoral year. As President Fernandez was saying in his inaugural speech, more than 70 countries, more than 80 electoral processes around the world. So could you please also include in your presentation what has been the use of artificial intelligence in the election super cycle of 2024? And also, if possible, a few comments regarding how has been used artificial intelligence in the elections here in the United States so far, and what is your prediction in terms of how this is going to be used in November the 5th? If the last year projection that we were analyzing that artificial intelligence could play a very negative role during the electoral campaign, increasing polarization and disinformation has been accomplished, or if you see that so far has not been so negative. Please. Yes.
Right. Thank you. So I'm glad you asked that question. It's very relevant. Just a few days ago, an editor at the Guardian newspaper emailed me and said, would you like to write an article for us, a tech editor for the newspaper? And when writing, he suggested a topic. He said, well, you study algorithms and how they impact fake news and misinformation. So what about an article explaining why AI hasn't been such a big deal in the election, why it hasn't influenced things the way we thought it would? And I thought, well, that's interesting that that's his prompt. And it made me pause and reflect and think, is that true? Is it really the case that AI has been kind of a dud in a good way and has not impacted the election? And I started to take stock, and I don't think I agree with that assessment. So I think it's more nuanced. I don't think we're in the doomsday scenario that some of us were predicting a year ago, as you mentioned, where it seemed like we could just be overrun with, you know, these incredible, sophisticated Russian bot armies. And I don't think we're in this kind of doomsday scenario where everything's collapsing and we're just overrun by AI. But I also don't think we're in the scenario where it just hasn't had any impact and it hasn't appeared. So I was trying to think, what's the big picture takeaway? I'm going to run through some examples that I'll try to use to build my argument. But I think my takeaway, my main answer to your question is, we've kind of been fixating on disinformation. And while doing so, it's kind of blinded us to what I think is the bigger issue with AI, which is propaganda. And these concepts sound similar, but just to kind of frame it, disinformation is really incorrect statements with the intent to mislead or deceive someone. Propaganda, I think, it can include disinformation, but it's kind of a broader thing. So for instance, when I log on Twitter, or X, as we're supposed to call it nowadays, every day, one of the first things I see is an AI-generated image of Elon Musk looking very masculine and heroic, and it's cringe. It's very obviously fake. But the reason why I think it's propaganda and not disinformation is these images are not being shared in a way where anyone will be deceived and think that's a true photograph. We all know that they're fake, but yet they have the same impact that we used to see a lot of in the authoritarian days, like in the Cold War, for instance, and fascism, where people manually by hand would just airbrush photos to make all their leaders look more heroic and manly and all these things. So I think we're kind of in a way back to that. It's less that we're flooded with false statements that people think are true, and it's more that AI is the modern airbrush that is helping paint portraits, both visual and text and many others, that are just trying to nudge our opinions. So that's my kind of main takeaway is it impacting the election? I think yes, but in a more propagandistic way rather than an outright disinformation way. So let me run through a couple examples of very concrete situations where AI is having, I don't know if it's having an impact, but it is potentially having an impact in the election. So one interesting one recently, and this was kind of on the borderline between disinformation and propaganda, was there were some AI-generated images that showed the very, very popular singer Taylor Swift wearing pro-Trump t-shirts and hats and, you know, painting her to look like a Trump supporter. And after the presidential debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, I think it was that night or maybe the next morning, Taylor Swift put out this message. At that point, she had not endorsed one of the candidates, but she put out an official message saying she is hereby endorsing Kamala Harris. And she explicitly stated, it was like a one-page little press release. She explicitly said the reason she's putting out the statement now is to correct the record because there were these AI-generated images that showed her supporting Trump. And she said, no, those were fake. Those were not true. Those were AI. This is the truth. So I think this is fascinating because in a way you could argue that's almost the AI influence backfiring, that some trolls or whoever they were on the internet thought, oh, this will be fun. We'll try to trick people into thinking Taylor Swift is a Trump supporter. And I doubt many people thought those images were real. I think they thought they were fun and humorous and they liked them, but nobody thought they were real. And yet the consequence is that Taylor Swift put out an endorsement, which she hadn't yet. So if anything, it might have nudged the election. She's very, very influential. It might have, especially with young voters, it might have actually, AI might have had the opposite impact that we expected. So I think that may not be an isolated event. We might see more politicians being forced to put out statements maybe earlier than they expected, to take stands on things, just to kind of set the record as all this AI stuff kind of froths up and bubbles up. So that was one interesting example. One terrifying one, which I have no idea if it had any impact, it seems like it was caught early enough, was just a week or so ago, I think maybe a week at the most, a US senator who happens to be the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, so very important, powerful senator, was in a Zoom meeting with what was supposed to be the former foreign minister for Ukraine. It turned out that it was someone impersonating the Ukrainian official using live deepfake technology. So not pre-recorded, but imagine you're in a Zoom meeting. It looks like you're talking to a person, but both the audio and the video are being live deepfaked. I haven't seen the video myself. I imagine it probably was sufficiently suspicious that people in attendance, recognize this. But this particular senator is, I think he might be close to 80 years old. And I just imagine being in that situation, like you've been in politics your whole life and suddenly having to confront these very bizarre technological changes. Like there's so much that has to be in your mind already. Now to think that I'll be Zooming with people and I don't even know that they are the people I believe. So this, I think, is a good example. Both of these are kind of related to what you're asking of how is AI impacting the election compared to our expectations. And I think the general expectation is we're going to have so much disinformation. We'll have fake stories that are going viral, fake images that people think are real. We were really focusing on this idea of fake things that people would believe are real. And I think AI images are fairly convincing, but somehow they often have a lot of tells. So the two examples I mentioned, one is it wasn't a viral incident. It was a very targeted attack at a politician to try to deceive them. And I think in a way that might have a better chance of happening, unfortunately, because it can be a much more focused thing rather than just hoping some stuff goes viral. And the other example, as I mentioned, was the sort of backfiring. So those are two interesting data points. As I said, I'm not sure if anyone will ever be able to measure and assign a number and say, this is, that AI is influencing the election 5% or 10%. I don't think that's possible. There's no way to run a controlled experiment and have one election with AI and one without and see, how it nudges the numbers. We'll never know. But I think it is very telling to look at examples that are happening and try to come up with a broader interpretation. And very quickly, the third data point that I want to mention is we tend to focus, as we heard in some of the remarks earlier, in Maureen's talk, for instance, AI has been around for a while. It's been used for a lot. It's not just the generative AI that is trendy right now, like image generation and ChatGPT. So I just want to point out, every time you log into almost any social media platform, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, any of these, they use algorithms to sort your feed. Those algorithms are powered by AI. Specifically, they're using AI to predict which posts you will engage with, like, share, comment on. The AI knows data about you. It knows data about other users, and it does what AI does. It does some kind of statistical analysis to try to predict which posts you'll engage with. And this is, I think, partly why I think we need to push the lens more towards propaganda than disinformation. AI still is very bad at telling what's true and what's not, but it's very good at figuring out what we will be excited by and engage with and interact with. So once again, as I said, when I log into Twitter nowadays, right away I see all these viral images, Elon Musk posts, all this stuff in my feed. It's not a matter of what's true and what's not. It's that AI is finding the stuff that we're drawn to, as it has been for the last 10 years or more. And I think we're getting a lot more propaganda because AI is a fun, exciting tool for a lot of people. People are making images and they're posting things. They have a lot more creative leeway, which can be good, but it can also be dangerous. So this is just to say, yes, AI is absolutely influencing the election because almost every human, 90% of the planet is on social media, and every social media platform is using AI. So there is invisible AI, not just the stuff that's more obvious like ChatGPT.
Thank you so much. It will be good then in the second intervention to try to predict how do you see, because of the high speed that artificial intelligence is having in the next cycle of elections, what are the major changes, but not only the negative effects, but also some positive effects that artificial intelligence can have in terms of democracy and election. Mekela, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So both Noah and I had the pleasure of speaking at this event last year. And that was really sort of at the beginning of the generative AI boom, right at the start of the what we could see was the potential impact of generative AI in elections. And so now, a year later, we can reflect back and look at what has happened, what hasn't happened, what policymakers have done, what they haven't done, what is on the horizon as well. It's a chance to sort of take stock of the state of play. I want to note that my remarks now are going to focus on the information environment, in part because that's top of mind for people. As you've mentioned, there have been a number of elections where coming up in a presidential election in November in the United States, which is extremely consequential, and deepfakes and false election information are very much top of mind for policymakers and the public. But there are a number of critical areas at the intersection of AI and democracy that I think are really important to talk about as well. AI and election security, the impacts of AI on public participation in government, both positive and negative, the importance of creating governance structures that are properly equipped to regulate AI systems. These are all issues that I hope we'll be able to talk about more in the panel discussion. I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about deepfakes. As I mentioned, it's very much top of mind for the public and policymakers. In some ways, it's sort of the most visible and visceral issue that we've seen in terms of the impact of generative AI on elections. Of course, there have been a number of high-profile deepfakes that have circulated across the globe. As Noah mentioned, there was the deepfake images that former President Trump circulated, purporting to depict Taylor Swift as endorsing his campaign and the consequences for that. AI-generated images and AI-generated imagery of dystopian scenarios occurring under a Democratic presidency have appeared in the American election. Deepfakes are also circulating across the globe. In Argentina's election, deepfake imagery, AI-generated imagery played or was very present. It was an express part of campaigning in that election. For example, a presidential candidate's campaign shared a deepfake of its opponent, explaining what a market for human organs would look like, purporting to falsely depicting the candidate as publicly supporting, in this particular instance, a market for human organs. In Slovakia, in one of the most notorious incidents to date, deepfake audio recordings circulated on the eve of a national election that falsely depicted a leading candidate as plotting to rig the election and as supporting raising beer prices. This was a very tight election, and some observers speculated that the audio deepfakes, which reached a very large audience, may have influenced the election results. That's sort of one of the most potentially impactful uses of generative AI that we have seen, and potentially problematic uses of generative AI that we have seen in elections to date. To say that policymakers have taken note of this is perhaps an understatement. Politicians are disproportionately affected by deepfakes, and so it has been the sort of area at the intersection of AI and democracy where policymakers have been most interested in taking action on this issue. That is certainly true in the US. There's a lot of interest at the federal level in taking action to address AI-generated political deepfakes. There are 2 bills that have passed out of the Senate Rules Committee. They have not become law yet, but they would regulate the use of generative AI in political advertising. The Federal Communications Commission is considering action to regulate AI in political advertising in the context of broadcast media, so radio and television advertising. But we've really seen the most sort of ambitious action take place at the state level. So just this year, between January 1st and July 31st, 14 states passed new laws or provisions addressing the use of deepfakes in political communications. In many cases, these are bipartisan efforts. Both Democrats and Republicans are interested in addressing these issues. From our perspective, the best of these are disclosure regimes that address synthetic content and apply to campaigns and political committees, and where they extend beyond that, where they're appropriately cabined and where they include intent and knowledge requirements. We've also seen policymakers around the world begin to take action. So Brazilian authorities have set forth rules for the use of AI in campaigning, requiring disclosures in certain contexts. So that's sort of the internal ecosystem when it comes to not the extent of it, of course, but part of it when it comes the sort of domestic information ecosystem. But of course, this time last year, we were sort of considering what the effect of generative AI would be on foreign influence campaigns, and we could only predict what it would be. But today, we're already seeing the impact of developments in generative AI on influence operations from Russia and China. So we have seen that Russia's disinformation efforts today rely on a combination of bots, real-life influencers, spoofed news websites, and AI-generated content. And these different tactics work in confluence with one another. So for some time, Russia's state-backed disinformation efforts have been creating fake news websites that are propagated with a view to interfering in elections in Europe and in America. That has certainly been the case. In this election cycle, a large number of fake news websites that have been created by Russian state-backed organizations have popped up in this election cycle. In certain cases, a number of those websites appear to be populated with content that has been created with the assistance of generative AI, at the very least with the assistance of translation capabilities that appear in generative AI tools. We know that Doppelganger, which is a notorious Russian disinformation operation, created several accounts on ChatGPT. In May, OpenAI said that it had disrupted Doppelganger's presence on its tools, in addition to several other foreign influence operations from other countries. And so this is very much present. Counterfeit items were sort of central to the Soviet Union's disinformation operations, and they persist today for Russia's disinformation efforts. In some cases, generative AI has seemingly allowed more scaling of content and the achievement of more sophistication with less effort. What we don't have as much of a sense of is the sort of impact of this. So generative AI has definitely made its way into foreign influence operations, but we have less of a sense of how much of a dent it's sort of made in the potential persuasive effect of these campaigns. I believe that we have sort of yet to see the unleashing of AI's most dangerous potential with respect to voter suppression. Earlier this year, a political consultant targeted New Hampshire voters with a now infamous robocall that mimicked President Biden's voice, urging them to sit out the presidential primary. This was sort of the first instance that we had seen of a large-scale effort to engage in voter suppression through the use of generative AI. But I do think that this is one of the areas where we need to be most concerned about the use of AI and where to vote in a more diverse manner and in a swifter manner than we have seen in the past, or to engage in sophisticated interactive digital disinformation efforts through encrypted platforms. So that's where I think we're watching as well. And I just want to quickly sort of pull out three themes. One is that as we've seen policymakers respond to this issue of sort of the information environment and democracy, we've seen AI developers have been relatively successful at convincing policymakers to focus on the end users rather than the AI companies themselves. And I think that there needs to be somewhat of a reorientation to be responsible about how they're developing their tools and their own impact on the information environment and other sort of issues, other risks to democracy. I think it is reasonable to require AI developers to exercise reasonable care to, for example, prevent the unwatermarked production of political deepfakes that pose a risk to election integrity or that promote voter suppression content and other election-related risks. The second is that I do think policymakers must be careful to balance freedom of speech against legitimate threats to the election process, not using deepfake regulation to unfairly target ordinary people with the specter of lawsuits or prosecution when they unknowingly share deepfakes or for the purposes of retaliation. We know that, unfortunately, that autocrats can sometimes abuse defamation laws or abuse anti-disinformation laws to target dissent or to target political opponents. And so it's critically important to maintain a balance between protecting legitimate speech and addressing some of the real risks to election integrity and the electoral process in a way that is proportionate and targeted. And then finally, I would say voters face an uphill task in navigating the information environment. I agree with much of what Noah has said, but I think that there is also, for example, when I log on to Facebook today, there is so much junk out there. There are, a lot of, and it's not even necessarily political content. There are a lot of entertainment websites that are entirely AI generated now that are flooding my newsfeed. It is much harder for people to find authoritative and accurate information. And some degree of skepticism of information is necessary, but excessive skepticism can be counterproductive and provide opportunities for bad actors to discredit authentic information. So government and tech companies need to step up to help to create the infrastructure to help voters navigate this environment. That means thoughtful digital literacy campaigns that don't worsen matters by decreasing trust in information generally. It means more meaningful verification for officials and legitimate news organizations on social media platforms, as well as mandatory watermarking and content provenance standards for generative AI content. So those are just some of the things that we can potentially sort of discuss more in the panel.
Thank you so much. We are running a little late because, fortunately, we are not going to have all the time that we anticipate that we will have. I had so many questions for me. It's a fascinating field, but I would like to open the floor to the audience to have thank you, to have a few questions in order to try to better understand. Thank you so much for the effort so far in terms of regulatory frameworks, to what extent we have made some progress, and to what extent the enforcement of those regulatory frameworks are presenting a very important challenge, and also to what extent the EMBs, the electoral management bodies, have the capacity to really understand and cope with this challenge of artificial intelligence. To what extent they have the capacity, internal capacity, institutional capacity to really address this very, very challenging issue. But I would like to open the floor. Jorge Heine.
Yes, I see some parallels between regulation of social media and regulation of AI. And sort of an overarching theme, and we saw it from the previous presentation on this new book that has come out, is the notion of censorship versus freedom of expression.
Exactly.
And it's very easy to cite on, well, who can be against freedom of expression? I mean, it's one of the greatest values in the world. Well, we recently had the case in Brazil in which a judge, Alexander de Moraes, took on the richest man in the world, Elon Musk, and said, tremendous amount of misinformation has been put out on X. We cannot deal with this. You must do something or I will close you down. And well, it was closed down. The immediate reaction in a lot of Western media was, Brazil has joined North Korea, China, and Iran in censoring social media. This cannot be. How can Brazil do something like this? And the next take is, well, they cannot take on Elon Musk. He will beat them. He is too powerful. Well, both of those comments were, to my mind, deeply wrong. In fact, Brazil was not joining North Korea and Iran and China, was doing the right thing because misinformation had played a very significant role in the Brazilian political system and something needed to be done. And in fact, in the end, Elon Musk backed down. So what I'm saying is there's a lesson there for how other countries deal with these issues. And I would say in the United States judicial system has not been as effective in dealing with the misinformation that is being spread out there in an election year by Elon Musk himself. So I wonder what the panel thinks of that.
Thank you so much. I think that there are two elements there. To what extent other countries are so powerful like Brazil and the judiciary in Brazil. And number two, I would like to invite Maureen, if you want, to step in the discussion about how you reconcile freedom of expression and misinformation. I mean, to what extent, based on freedom of expression, you can go and lie, and make disinformation saying, well, I am protected by freedom of expression. So at one point, I would like also to invite you to make a comment.
Well, I think the Brazil example is an important one. And what I would say as a Canadian constitutional lawyer is that in our constitution, we have a section 1, which is
Which constitution?
Canadian.
Canadian constitution.
Yes. So unlike the American, where you have a lot of jurisprudence of saying what is free speech, what isn't, it becomes a category, and a lot of the analysis is sort of buried in the biases of the court at any given era. Canada has section 1, and the test for any, I'm not an absolutist myself when it comes to free speech. But I think that each case needs to constitutionally be weighed carefully to determine what the appropriate limits are in any given situation. So in Canada, the limits are such reasonable limits prescribed by law as are demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So the limits have to be reasonable, and we have good jurisprudence about proportionality. They have to be prescribed by law. So I think what in the example of both Brazil and France, where they've gone after the well, they're slightly different, but in Brazil, let's take Brazil. You've got a judge issuing a mass ban on a giant social media platform that millions and millions of people around the world communicate on. The limits are not prescribed by law. They're not demonstrably justified because you're not looking at all the different cases. It's just a mass flat out ban. And I guess I don't know what the judge's reasoning was, but if it was similar to what happened in France, I imagine that the legal theory was Elon Musk is the directing mind of this company, is refusing to cooperate either with lawful access requests from Brazil for disclosure of who said certain or the certain criminal activity or speech on the platform, and so it's aiding and abetting a criminal activity. That would be one legitimate legal theory. And I guess the other theory is that he's just responsible for anticipating and policing anything that this particular Brazilian judge or Brazilian state would consider misinformation, which, I think as I laid out, what shocked me when I started to look at what was being censored in this initiative that I described about all the government agencies working through intermediaries and with academic centers and NGOs to flag and demand the takedown or the de-amplification of material on their platforms, is that it covered every contested political issue of the Biden regime. So, it was enforcing a narrative of a particular administration. And it just shows you what the temptation is. It's a huge temptation. And so if you pass like a flat ban, there's a better word for it, a ban that is mass shutdown of a whole social media platform that's used internationally, that is not a legitimate constitutional analysis in my view. So I'll just leave it there.
We should have Judge Moraes here in order to have the other, but it's very good. Thank you so much. Noah and Virginia, do you have any comment regarding this? Please go ahead, because I think that is a very hard topic.
I'll use it to pivot back to what you asked me earlier, which is predictions, because I can tie it together. So I was thinking about trying to predict what would happen next year. And here's my guess, and I'm going to be deliberately a little controversial. I think AI is going to have a big influence in politics and elections next year through the new class of billionaires and possibly trillionaires it makes. So what I mean is, thinking back, Sam Bankman-Fried, who formerly was a crypto billionaire, now he's in prison. He apparently was considering paying $5 billion of his own cash to get Donald Trump to not run for president in 2020, literally just offering him $5 billion to stay home and not run. It didn't happen, but that is one way to influence. Elon Musk paid $44 billion to buy Twitter, and he's turning it into a right-wing propaganda machine. So right now, last I checked, I think it's like the 7 richest people in the world are all tech moguls. The 6 biggest companies or most profitable companies in the world are all tech companies. Yeah. So what I believe is going to happen in a year is AI is going to make a bunch of new billionaires. It's going to make some billionaires into trillionaires eventually. So far, these are all white men. These are the people that I think will be influencing things that I'm scared of, perhaps more than the AI itself. I do think AI has not had a huge impact in the election. I think Elon Musk, he's certainly trying, and maybe he's succeeding. So I think that's, in a way, that's an overlooked threat to our democracy, is these rich people who can kind of do whatever they want with very little accountability.
Very, very good point. Virginia, it's almost, 1 a.m. there. If you remain awake, ¿Cuál es? We cannot hear you. No te podemos escuchar.
I wondered if I could just say something, Noah, to pitch in while we're doing the, just to fill in while we're doing the technical stuff. I think Elon Musk bought Twitter for the data. I mean, they're in a race to create AI, these big tech guys, right? And Musk is more ambitious than any, and Twitter is the richest cache of data there is. And one thing that I meant to add in my response was, if you ask tech platforms to anticipate or if you demand that they censor, that they become the censors, you're going to have immense chill, because if they're subject to 5% fines on their global earnings for every violation, which is what's being proposed in some legislation. They're going to overcorrect by not letting anything sensitive go forward on their platforms. So you don't want to give the court or the states or job about determining where the lines of free speech ought to be in each case to the tech platforms, because you're just going to create a giant chill on speech, I think.
Thank you very much. We will keep continuing because I think that this is a central issue, how to balance. Mekela.
Ya puedo.
Virginia, ¿puedes? ¿Ya?
Sí,
Okay.
ya me escucháis.
Dale, te escuchamos.
Sí, yo estoy de acuerdo con lo que dice Maureen, sobre todo el tema de la libertad de expresión, no solo en términos de leyes, en términos periodísticos, es una línea muy difusa, ¿no? Entonces, por ejemplo, Brasil da ejemplo más de censura que de libertad de expresión. Eso incluso se le ha vuelto en contra, ¿no? Desde un punto de vista negativo. Por ejemplo, como dijo la experta, ¿no? Twitter, Elon Musk es un empresario, es una empresa privada, entonces es el que dirige. Por ejemplo, en Facebook, al año se eliminan más de 5.000 millones de cuentas fake, ¿no? Twitter parece que no tiene ese filtro, todo lo contrario. De hecho, la proliferación de rumores y de bulos se genera particularmente a través de esa red social. Pero ¿dónde está el límite de la libertad de expresión? Eso es algo muy difuso. Es muy complejo de delimitar, es muy complejo de precisar, ¿no? Desde el punto de vista de la libertad de expresión, incluso desde el punto de vista de la legalidad. Lo que sí se puede, por supuesto, delimitar es la desinformación, sobre todo porque eso va en contra de la libertad de expresión. Entonces es importante, lo importante es generar el debate. El debate sea el foco para intentar generar por lo menos unas posibles soluciones o unas posibles salidas a tanta desinformación y tanto caos informativo que hay. Un ejemplo, a Donald Trump le cerraron su cuenta en Twitter en diciembre de 2020 por incitar al odio. Eso no ha servido absolutamente de nada. Tuvo otras plataformas, tuvo otras voces. Entonces allí es donde se ve precisamente que no hay una línea, ¿no? Una línea clara realmente en esa limitación o esta limitación de lo que es la libertad de expresión, y mucho menos en las redes sociales donde interactuamos constantemente.
Gracias, Virginia. Comment to you, Mekela, because it's regarding this freedom of expression and disinformation. What about if November 5, one of the two candidates that lose the election start saying they steal the election? I am the one who I win, and start making a huge campaign supported by some social platform giving support to this disinformation. What is the limit? I mean, should we allow freedom of expression to really say what they want without any justification? Or we should limit in some way? But if we start limiting, who is the one who is going to decide, and what are the consequences of limiting freedom of expression? So that's why I don't see a very easy solution, but I think that it's a crucial one. How you see it?
Well, we have existing laws forbidding voter intimidation and election interference in the US context. And there are occasions where false information can amount to voter intimidation, or it can amount to improper interference in the election process. It would be a context-dependent inquiry. So, I think it depends on the circumstance, but where falsehoods, I think, are sort of egging on political violence, or they are propagating campaigns to overturn the legitimate result of an election. There's potential, potential to act depending on the situation.
Thank you so much. Other questions? Yes, please. The micro is right there. Okay.
Sí, buenas noches. Congratulations to all of you. You made an excellent exposition here. And I just want to say that Maureen Webb, she made a fantastic introduction. But at the same time, I thought it was a little scary when you say that AI, we don't know what's going to happen with AI. We're not going to have any control, like maybe in the future. And then when the panelists here, you validated everything that she said. And I'm like, well, how are we going to control AI in the future? And if there's any plans for handling AI, just in case it goes out of control? That's my question.
We are incorporating a new panelist.
I think Professor Murato's introduction, where he talked about the future of governance, where AI could be making decisions for humankind, I find that frightening. And I don't know the answer. I don't know what you do about that entirely. However, I was reading about the EU AI Act, which apparently is the first comprehensive act about regulating AI. And I'm sure I'd have criticisms if I read the whole thing, but it did seem to me that the general approach was somewhat important, at least. But I mean, really, tonight we're talking, or it's becoming tonight, we're talking about two sides, right? We're talking about people using AI and the government using AI. And so my talk was more about the government using AI and the dangers of that, and your remarks were more about people using AI, and so what I liked about the basic framework of the the EU AI Act is that it identifies high risk and low risk areas to use AI.
Yes.
So they say, it's low risk to use it for simply stopping spam, that kind of thing, slowing down networks, things like that. It's high risk to use it for law enforcement, education, some of the core functions of government. And you can think why, right? Judges are already using AI in sentencing, for example. And a case I was reading, I think it was in the American jurisdiction recently, the judge, the Court of Appeal basically said, well, the trial judge can use it even though because AI can look at all the data about recidivism and different characteristics of an offender and suggest a sentence that's going to be effective. And but because it's a black box, nobody really knows why the AI is saying that. And because these AI programs also now have machine learning, so they're learning on the data sets. So they evolve from what the original coders said. So they're not just coders saying,
Correct.
weight this way and this that way and come up with the mathematical formula. They're actually learning, and we don't. And so I've heard that coders can't even necessarily reverse engineer what a machine learning system does. And so the court said, the judge can use it, but he has to basically take it, weigh it with a grain of salt. What does that mean? I don't know. So I think these are very, but every single, I really urge you as policymakers and leaders, every single issue, it's like drinking from a fire hose, but every single issue merits its own careful analysis and consideration. Broad hammers to get rid of inconvenient things are not going to work. We could do a lot of damage to ourselves, to our existing norms. And I'm a great advocate of maintaining existing norms because they reflect the intelligence of decades and centuries of human thought.
Have a seat. Thank you so much. Yes, please.
First of all, thank you for your refreshing and positive view on the hacking world, because unless you get inside that world, you see hackers are just like these mean people that are trying to disrupt the whole world and kill us all or whatever. So, and in that sense, how we can learn about the way they work in collaboration. And as Professor Sachs said this morning, and that's what our region needs to be able to develop, to collaborate and work together. And it's something that we really don't understand as Latinos as much. And for me, it's been an eye-opening to see the hacking community, how they work. But in that sense, on how AI learns so quickly, you think we will be able to catch up in regulating AI? What is your uptake on that?
Thank you very much for these very important questions. And that is also very central, no? To what extent the regulatory framework can move as quickly as the development of AI. We just have to remember that 2 years ago, this was not the conversation. That was when ChatGPT, what was 1 or 2, appears. And there was a request for a moratorium for 6 months. Remember, those people writing this letter saying we should stop everything for 6 months to give us time to really reflect about what's going on. Well, no one stopped. A lot of money put more money into this, making trillions and billions and so forth. So the problem is the speed of the development and the progress of artificial intelligence and the speed of the regulatory framework. So based on that questions, we will start with you, Mekela.
Sure. Well, I think I'm a fan in general of building iteration into governance frameworks. So, for example, when creating legislative frameworks on complex technical issues, directing agencies to periodically revisit regulations and update them as new evidence comes about, as technologies evolve. And then I also think it's critically important to think about building capacity within governance structures. I think tech companies have more sway than they should particularly over congressional action, in part because there's so much expertise on generative AI within tech companies. But building more expertise into governance structures, which Congress has made some moves towards, and the executive branch in the federal government has as well, in terms of hiring for AI expertise, increasing staffing within agencies. But I think it is important, both for the issue of not improperly delegating important questions to the regulated industry, but also in order to be able to move as swiftly as possible at this moment in time. It's really important to think about setting up the infrastructures within governing bodies to ensure that it's possible to move with the pace that is required.
Thank you so much. We received a request from the artificial intelligence saying that we need to close this in the next 10 minutes. So we will have to comply or we are going to run into a big problem. So very short comments, 1 minute each. Noah, Maureen, and then Virginia, and then we give the floor to President Fernandez for the closing remarks.
I think for me, what helps is just to take a really big picture view, is to really focus on the economics. We get very fixated on disinformation, on the details of AI and this and that. But I really feel like if you look at the flows of money, who is getting rich, who's benefiting from the technology, you will understand how the politics will be influenced. You don't have to know how the technology works. You have to know who's getting rich from the technology, and that's going to drive the politics for better and worse.
Very good remarks. The 2.8 trillion in 2 years, not bad business, huh? And just for one company. Maureen.
I just want to, is that on? I just want to comment that I met hackers at the Chaos Computer Camp that were taking part in innovation hubs in Chile. So I just wanted to make you aware, first of all, that hackers exist throughout the tech world. As I said, they are the pioneers who invented the internet, the personal computer, and the World Wide Web. So you'll find them in many places. They work particularly in security, but other places too. But places in South America are trying to create their own industries, and they're trying to attract that talent. And obviously the hackers are highly talented, and offering, money and community to develop their startups within these countries, and then hopefully start their own tech businesses.
Thank you so much. Virginia?
Virginia, ¿nos escuchas?
Ahora, sí. Yo pienso que la reflexión está precisamente ahora en la vorágine informativa y desinformativa en la que nos encontramos. No podemos negar la evidencia, y sobre todo el ritmo tan exponencial y a la velocidad a la que estamos manejando los niveles de inteligencia artificial para generar tanto, por ejemplo, en el campo de la medicina es indispensable, pero en el campo de la información necesitamos ver realmente cómo hacer, no para hacer una regulación, sino, como decía, una alfabetización digital. El 70% de esa población mundial conectada a Internet necesita cierta educación, cierta comunicación digital. No solamente es estar en las redes o tener una huella o tener presencia, sino educar, y desde el punto de vista social y periodístico la responsabilidad es, por supuesto, informar más, sobre todo, por ejemplo, en estos tiempos donde estamos con las guerras, donde estamos en una constante campaña electoral a nivel mundial. Entonces, para mí es fundamental, sobre todo, esa educación digital que debe haber a futuro y ser un poco visionario en ese aspecto.
Muchísimas gracias. Cerramos entonces con dos comentarios. Uno es los desarrollos que estamos viendo en marcos regulatorios. Unión Europea, en Europa no hay ninguna de las grandes firmas, pero son los primeros que tienen marcos regulatorios. Segundo, el Código de Ética en materia de inteligencia artificial de UNESCO. Tercero, el grupo de trabajo que acaba de crear el secretario Guterres en materia de inteligencia artificial y los códigos de principios que han ido emitiendo. O sea, que yo creo que vamos a ir viendo en los próximos, we are going to see in the next few years a very big progress in terms of regulatory frameworks. The key issue here is what type of frameworks and what type of enforcement, because I think that in Latin America, at least, we are very good in producing law after law after law. The key issue here is the enforcement. And second, is a final reflection. I'm going to say this in Spanish, please excuse me. Hace 23 años hubo dos películas, Odisea en el espacio y Inteligencia Artificial, que presentaban el tema hace tan solo 2 décadas como ciencia ficción. Bueno, esta ciencia ficción hoy se ha convertido en realidad y es una realidad que o buscamos una manera inteligente de controlarla, porque llegó para quedarse, o creo que hay incluso un grave riesgo de tipo existencial en el mal uso de la inteligencia artificial. Con estas reflexiones, agradecer muchísimo a Mekela, agradecer muchísimo a Noah. Maureen, thank you so much again for being with us. Virginia, muchísimas gracias. Creo que es hora que vayas ya a la cama gracias por acompañarnos hasta tan tarde. A la audiencia, un fuerte aplauso para los panelistas.